All right. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a special treat. Someone who actually reached out to me to be on the show, Trevor, who's written a new book called Shroud Pilled. So, first of all, welcome to the show there, Trevor. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. I love I have a lot of fans that are really interested in the Shroud. So the fact that you've got a book talking about the Shroud and the evidence and stuff like that is going to be fascinating to my audience here. So I'm just kind of curious, just before we get into talking about your book itself, do you want to just sort of take some time to introduce yourself, your background and maybe a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm probably the last person in the world that anyone would expect to write a book about this topic. I was an atheist most of my life, from a pretty young age. I've met a lot of people like this who, for whatever reason, tends to be scientists, are determined to be an atheist from like too young of an age. Like, why are they even thinking like this? Robert Sapolsky, who's like a kind of a famous scientist and atheist. He said at 12 years old, he knew, that he was an atheist. And I think maybe it's partly just growing up in the 80s and 90s. It was such a like scientific moment, the Human Genome Project, the space shuttle. It just felt like humanity had stolen the fire and we were going to figure it out. And so I became a scientist for that. Not for that reason. I mean, I was genuinely interested in it. I like kind of puzzle solving and looking at data and trying to figure things out. But part of it was this idea like if you're going to do something meaningful, well then you kind of have to be a scientist, right? What else is there? Maybe an engineer or scientist, but anyway, along the way I kind of realized that you know, this whole scientific worldview is sort of its own religion, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. A lot of our own axioms that we break ourselves, and then you look at the history of the kind of the fathers of science and how they felt about the universe and the creator, and anyway it just becomes untenable. So yeah, I wrote a book about that. That was sort of my first book, called God's Eye View, just kind of documenting why it's not irrational to be a believer in God. And over the past sort of 5 years, become increasingly interested in these topics. There's no good reason for me to write about this topic as someone who I do neuroscience research and compete for grant funding, and it's probably not good for my career to be investigating the shroud, but I can't help it. It's just so obviously interesting, and so I get why it's sort of had a resurgence in popularity recently, but for whatever reason it's still kind of viewed as silly by sort of the mainstream academic world. So anyway, I decided to throw caution to the wind and I wrote a book about it and learned a lot along the way myself, a lot that I didn't know. So
Excellent. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. As a philosopher, I noticed you didn't mention those as one of the careers that's meaningful, but
it is. Listen, when I was saying that was my old self. That's how the old version of Trevor felt. Of course, it's meaningful. Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, no worries. I was just ribbing you there, but yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. Yeah, there was this kind of religious almost fervor among atheists and stuff, where they hold to scientism and materialism and stuff like that, and it is literally almost a religion to them. It's just an unquestioned
it's
option.
it's not almost a religion. It is absolutely a religion. It has all the hallmarks of religion. It's sort of this the rational atheist religion is sort of collapsed in most sciences, but it is alive and well in medicine. And I think that is just because you're wielding godlike power as a physician or as a scientific researcher, and really for most agnostic or atheist people, medicine is the only realistic savior to them. Like they just have this idea that whatever happens to me, I'll be able to get cured by a scientist, or, if I can just live another 30 years, they'll figure out how to get us to live forever, or whatever. it's religion. It is absolutely religion. It's not like it was in the 2000s
Right.
where, everyone in the biology department was just absolutely atheist and they were incredibly condescending to anyone who had any alternative ideas. I think it's better, but it's still alive and well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned that your expertise is in neuroscience. Was there any evidence in your field in particular that that was helpful in changing your mind to become more theistically minded or anything, even Christian related? If I don't know if you're, yeah. Let me.
I am a Christian. So, um, I that's what the first book was about. It was about what what is it in neuroscience, and actually ended up being very quantum physics heavy, that is faith based. And it turns out pretty much everything, like the central theme of the way we study consciousness in neuroscience, is just completely, for a whole, we could do a whole episode about that, but for a whole list of reasons, is untenable. It's pseudoscientific, and it's not a worldview you can hold without faith. And it's just this idea that consciousness emerges out of computation. And there's no reason to believe that other than it answers the question of why we're conscious. And that's, if you're an atheist, you need an answer to that question. You need a way to explain, like, I feel like I'm in here looking out at a real world. Why is that? Why do I feel like I'm located in here? Why do I feel like an observer to this suite of sensors I've been given through evolution, right? I'm not just a camera taking pictures. I'm someone looking at pictures that my cameras, my eyes are taking, right? And same with your ears and all your other senses. There's a passenger, there's a ghost in the machine. Why? And so neuroscience's answer is basically that, well, it's just an emergent phenomenon, which doesn't mean anything. It's pseudoscientific, it's non-falsifiable. That's book one. That's God's eye view. But once you cross that bridge, you're like, oh, okay. So atheism really was a religion, because now that I feel that it's untenable, I'm having kind of like an existential crisis,
Yeah.
and that's all the evidence you need that it was spiritual. Um, anyway, and so I kind of document that journey. But I think maybe the question you're asking is, how did you get to the shroud from neuroscience?
That's where I was about to. Yeah. Okay. So great. So you've gotten to God and maybe some kind of substance dualism and that sort of thing. And with consciousness, how the heck did you get into the shroud? What's the relation there? How did that come up?
Yeah, there's not really a straightforward logical answer to that. I mean, I think once you go from atheist to, maybe I would have called myself agnostic for a long time. You it's nothing but questions, right? And you're paralyzed by this, like, I can't know. How could I know? And that's sort of the humble aspect of agnosticism that I think is appealing compared to atheism. Atheists are so certain, right? They know, and that really is a faith. Sorry, my dog's running around upstairs. Hopefully you can't hear that. That really is a type of faith. So then, I kind of move into agnosticism, and I don't remember when I became aware of the shroud. It was very recent. Like, maybe I think I had heard of it as a kid and just kind of, something you laugh at,
Yeah.
like images of the Virgin Mary and a grilled cheese sandwich, like, it's just like, oh, those believers, like, they'll believe anything.
Yeah.
But then, like, a few years ago, I started thinking about it more seriously. I probably saw it on a podcast or something. I said, oh, that's interesting, because of course it's not real, was my initial impression, but man, what if it was real? And I still didn't really get into it until after I became a Christian. And I didn't become a Christian because of the shroud by any means. That's a whole other long story. But this is what I decided. Completely distinct from my research career and my spiritual journey. I was just like, I've watched enough videos about the shroud at this point, and every video I watch, I just know that person has a very strong bias. If they're a skeptic, I can see it. I can see that they're cherry picking evidence. They're making sort of straw man arguments for the authenticity and tearing them down. But then also too, like I watch a lot of the videos of the people who are pro Shroud authenticity, and it's not as bad by any means, but I kind of see like elements of the same thing, like
Yeah,
maybe not really presenting the skeptical arguments as strongly as they could. And so I was like, okay, I just want to know what's true. I I don't need it to be real, right? It would be cool. I am biased. I'd like it to be real, but I don't need it to be real. I don't need it to be fake. What if I just try to figure this out for myself and looked at some of the source evidence? And after doing that for a few months, I was like, oh, I love writing. So I was like, I got to write a book about this. It's way more interesting than I would have guessed. Um, and at first, my publisher was like, "You can't. There's not enough to write a book about the Shroud of Turin." And I showed him all the stuff, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, I had no. Most people have no idea how much this thing has been studied."
absolutely. Yeah, there's just so much to it and stuff like people have no idea the depth of. I think Joe Marino, he's a famous shroud guy. I'm sure you know.
Yeah,
He's estimated there's over 100 academic disciplines that have been involved in studying the shroud. So you can just imagine the wealth of knowledge and literature out there. So all right. So obviously you've written this book called Shroud Pilled. So what is the book about it? What's the
yeah.
do you have like an argument or like what are the things you cover in it?
So I try to be pretty clear early on that I'm not a Shroud of Turin expert. I am someone who's, for work, like my professional training is to read and write research papers. And so kind of standing at the outset of this journey, I was like, okay, there's a lot of books about the shroud already. What can I add to this? And some of the feedback I got on my first book is that, and as a professor, this has been feedback I've gotten, kind not to be like too ego inflating here, but like that I can make dense topics approachable. And so that's always been the compliment that I've been paid, that like it means the most to me, because I've sat through so many boring lecture classes, but I've also sat through classes where like I'm on the edge of my seat, So I'm aware of this idea that the same topic can be presented in a way that doesn't resonate with people and can be presented in a way that does. And so I didn't feel like I really needed to know everything about the shroud to do like a approachable view of the history of and of the evidence. And like the first book, I was aiming it at me like maybe 6 years ago. Someone who is probably starting to come around to the idea of God, sort of agnostic. Um, what would convince them? And it's funny. It's a quick tangent. With the first book, that was the goal. I'm not sure if all the good feedback I've gotten has been from Christians. I think when you're atheist or agnostic, you're not in the mood to have your paradigms challenged.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think it's a tough, like if I were trying to sell books, I think I would just write the books to Christians. But I don't know, just because I went through this journey, like I'm trying to get those people on the fence. Like that is the target I have in mind when I write. And so to do that for the shroud, I try to take a really impartial view. Like I say up front, I am now someone who believes in the literal resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, I've acknowledged my bias, but I don't need the shroud to be real, right? I've spent most of my life believing it's not real. Most Christians, until probably recently, assumed it was fake. So I don't need it to be real. So I try to take like a very impartial stance. Now, if you're super skeptical, you're going to see this as a pro shroud book for sure, because it is. I mean, ultimately, the conclusion I come to is I think it's probably real. And by real, I mean, the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, and maybe even basically a photograph of the resurrection. But it's not. I don't present straw man skeptical arguments. Like I try to present the best arguments. The fact that they have, like Garla Shelley has made fairly reasonable recreations of it. And I don't make the argument that medieval artists couldn't possibly understand the anatomy. It's like, come on, of course they could. These guys were like some of our archetypes for being like well-rounded, scientific, artistic guys, you know. Um, so I don't try to make those like low-level arguments. I don't try to make the hey, it's AB blood, and that's the royal blood stuff
Yeah.
or Eucharistic miracles. I don't try to do all that. I try to present like the overall thing. I try to create a bar that skeptics would have to contend with to make their argument because it's grounded in the evidence, it's grounded in scientific principles. I spend This is going to sound boring. This is not a good pitch for book sales, but I try to make the statistical arguments about the carbon dating. I try to write a book that your grumpiest atheist cousin at Thanksgiving would read and be like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't agree with it, but it's kind of interesting. You know,
Yeah.
that's who I had. That's who I have in mind when I was writing.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. Well, let's kind of turn to look at specific evidences then. And I
Yes.
like how you separated it into two. There are two authenticity questions with the shroud. There's the historical authenticity. Did this thing cover Jesus, or is it just some
Yeah.
medieval hoax or something? And then there's the miraculous authenticity. The images were they formed miraculously at the resurrection or not? So let's start with the historical question. What was on the positive side? What were some of the pro-shroud historical evidences that convinced you to go, yeah, this thing probably covered Jesus' corpse?
Well, I mean, before you even get to the pro side, I think what you like as a dispassionate person looking at the evidence has to contend with is this seemingly impossible coincidence that you know we believe the shroud emerged in the 14th century and I can't pronounce French words in Lyre.
Right, yeah.
Descharny, the French knight, just returned from the Fourth Crusade, and then all of a sudden the shroud pops up, right? So we have this definitive. We all agree, at the very least, the shroud was present in the mid 14th century. So then, in 1989, a Nature paper is published that says, oh, this is dated to 1325, give or take.
Mhm.
Done, right? Like that's just such a compelling overlap of evidence. Like it's too compelling to be coincidental for a rational person to see that and not dismiss it. And so this was like the damning thing that happened in 1989 that completely reshaped the way we think about the shroud. That the typical person, even the typical Christian, thinks about the shroud, and
Yeah.
it just kind of went away after that. So I think we have to contend with that first
Yeah.
before we even start thinking about like historical arguments and did it go back to Constantinople and Edessa and stuff.
Sure.
So for me, so you've got the two. It's Tristan Casabianca, but even before him, I think Marco Riani, I believe, had done some really interesting statistical work with the carbon dating. So, um, but basically, these guys, these three labs from Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, they were all given pieces of shroud material, and they literally, like the way I understand the reading, is that they literally show up at the cathedral early in the morning, and they're like having an argument about where to cut a sample from the shroud. So from the very beginning, it wasn't systematic. And so anyway, they cut it from a corner, and that's problematic because there's been burns and potentially repairs of the shroud. But they cut it from the corner and they date it. And so and they had good methods really because they also dated control samples.
Yeah.
So they dated these control samples, and their agreement on the control samples was excellent. And so people, I hear like pro shroud people saying carbon dating is unreliable. That's not it. Carbon dating is excellent. The problem is you need to know if you're dating the shroud or not. And so you're going to get an accurate date of whatever material is in there, right? But if you're not dating the shroud, then it doesn't, however accurate your test is, it doesn't matter. So what they found is that there's much more disagreement in the intra lab samples. So they take multiple samples at each lab. In the Shroud sample than there was in the control samples. And so right there, that's interesting. Like, why would that be the case? What we have these known fabrics that are 2,000 years old, and they can date them with perfect agreement, within the lab and between the labs, very tight agreement. But then on the Shroud, we get, much bigger error bars. So right off the bat, that's problematic. And then also, you can look, and this was Marco Riani's paper. Excellent, excellent paper. And he's not even really a Shroud guy. I was looking at his research. He's a statistician through and through. Like, he does all sorts of really compelling statistical work. And he basically does like a spatial model. So he recreates where each little sample was taken from this corner that was cut out of the Shroud, and he shows that there's a linear trend.
Right.
So, and I forget which direction it is, and you probably know this better than me, but like as you move from one side to the other, the age either inflates or deflates. I forget which. And, that's an example of systematic error. And so this is a type of error that statistics can't contend with. This is not what statistics is for. Statistics is for dealing with random error. And so systematic error implies that there's something systematic going on. For example, maybe either the Shroud is contaminated by all sorts of foreign material in that section, or there was a repair. And so if there was a repair, as you get closer to that repair, you'd expect the age to change wildly. And so that's exactly what you see. You see this linear, systematic change in age as you move from left to right. And so that right there is more than enough evidence to just completely dismiss that 1989 carbon dating. I'll stop there. I could keep rambling, but I
Yeah,
can.
no, I think you're absolutely right. Because look, back in 1989, the journal Nature was made aware of this statistical problem that you talk about, and they said the heck they were told specifically not to publish,
Yeah,
that they had a 95% degree of confidence kind of thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And they went ahead and published it anyways. I think that's outright fraudulent kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really bizarre because Nature is obviously a credible journal. They have high standards. Even 40 years ago they had high standards. So yeah, I don't know what that's about. It's very strange, and the systematic error is just one thing. Like you mentioned with the 95% confidence interval. I mean, there's tests you do. There's statistical tests you do to determine if you can combine measurements between sites to generate a confidence interval. And for people, no, 95% confidence interval doesn't mean like 95% probability that it's accurate. I see that reported all the time on like Reddits and online blogs and stuff. It's just a window that you generate based on the data. So if you said 99% confidence interval, the window would be smaller, but it doesn't mean they're 99, or it would be bigger. Sorry. It doesn't mean they're 99%. Anyway, um, but there's a test you do to see if you can combine samples, and it failed the test. The results were too different between the labs to combine them into a
right.
confidence interval, yet they were. And so, yeah, that is an issue. But the systematic bias thing, that is more than a statistical problem. That is like a complete discreditation of the finding. When there's systematic bias in your statistics, you don't publish Nature papers.
Yeah,
You know? and so,
yeah,
and so this is a problem that's just swept under the rug, literally. Like, there's obviously requests for the data, like you mentioned, and requests for the methods. Crickets. It wasn't until Tristan Casabianca filed a Freedom of Information request. He got the data from the British Museum. In my opinion, I give him a ton of credit in the book, Tristan Casabianca, because I think really he's the one who popularized, and he's one of the reasons why the Shroud authenticity thing is making such a comeback right now. But really, Marco, I think, had already thoroughly discredited the date
yeah.
before he even got to it. He just like was the icing on the cake. So so that argument is still what you will be confronted with if you talk about the Shroud with someone who has like a surface level understanding. Is like, hey, it was carbon dated to the 14th century, and we know from the historical records that it showed up in the 14th century. you think it's just a coincidence that we got the same date? so, so I think we just have to start off just like, no, that's not an argument you can make anymore. You have to pretend like if I was a judge, I'd say like jury, you need to disregard the last statement you heard about the carbon dating. This is not evidence to be taken seriously. And also, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Sorry to interrupt. I have
No.
a couple follow-up questions, but so on the carbon 14, I just want to get from you, are you saying that you're sort of open as to the cause of this systematic error? Like, or do you have a theory? Do you go for the invisible reweave? Or do you think it's more likely some form of contamination? Like, I know my friend Bob Rucker goes for neutron irradiation, which is obviously a miraculous form of contamination. But what do you have a theory, or do you remain sort of open to whatever is causing this?
I would say I'm kind of, pardon the pun, but sort of agnostic on why this is the case. I mean, I think if you're trying to be dispassionate about it, you have to be. You just have to say, the fact is we can't take this date seriously because there is systematic error. So that's it. Now, if you're asking me to kind of like speculate, I mean, they found a lot of contamination in the samples. They found various cotton threads, and maybe that's normal for a linen shroud, but that's not, I would say, typical. They found all sorts of things, contaminants in there that could potentially explain the level of disagreement between labs. But the linear disagreement, the fact that there's a pattern in the disagreement, definitely suggests that there is a somewhere in that corner a like a locus of contamination, like a serious point of contamination that as you approach it, your numbers are more off the mark. And so in that case, I don't even like using the word invisible reweaving because people put it in italics with quotes to kind of make fun of the idea that it's invisible, like
Yeah.
because believers are so silly that they think like there's invisible magic. It's just like they the Savoys, the people who owned the linen, had expert seamstresses and people who worked with fabric, and they could potentially stitch a repair. It's not like a ridiculous claim like some people would make it sound. Um, and there is evidence of repair. So yeah, if there's a repair in the 16th century, it would make sense that you get a 1300s date if you're near that repair. And so to me, it does seem like there's a blend of original shroud material and newer shroud material. And so as you move closer to the newer shroud material, you get this linear change in age. But again, I'm agnostic to the idea. I don't know.
Cool. All right. So the other thing I want to ask you, so you kind of mentioned, well, hey, see the carbon 14 is garbage. We can't rely on it to date the actual calendar age of the shroud. And therefore this argument from the coincidence goes away. But I would just sort of beg to differ. So let's assume that the carbon 14 is in fact garbage. Um, why is there that coincidence that an erroneous carbon 14 would just so happen to get the wrong date coincident with the Darcy memorandum and the medieval
Yeah.
documentation? Like,
I mean, if you look at the dates the actual labs got, there is not really a coincidence. It's just only when you average the three that you get a confidence interval that sort of encompasses that 14th century date. So I think, is it Tristan Casabianca's paper that shows the original labs dates with confidence intervals? People should check that out.
yeah,
They're pretty all over the place. I could be wrong, but I don't think like any of the labs said like 1350 plus or minus 100 years.
right.
I think they're kind of all over the place. And but I'm not saying it's not interesting. The coincidence is certainly interesting, but taken with the fact that none of the labs really dated it to that time exactly, and the fact that the repairs would have been done in the 16th century. And so if you have a mix of 16th century to first century, this sort of gradient, if you're near a 16th century contaminated area, you would expect it to skew, maybe 100, a few hundred, or 500 years lower, older. So to me, it's interesting, but it's not the damning piece of evidence that it is presented as, I guess.
Fair enough. Okay. So, yeah, I just want to kind of turn over I asked you originally, looking at the pro shroud side now. So we kind of dealt with the skeptics trying to argue that it's medieval. What is the evidence that actually shows the shroud is pre-medieval, or that you find convincing?
Historical evidence.
Or yeah, like anything that dates the shroud
Yeah.
prior to the medieval period.
Yeah, I think, there's all sorts of dating on the shroud that I sort of view with kind of not skepticism. It's interesting. I file it away. There is the X-ray scatter
Mhm.
data, that sort of dates it to a first century thing. That's obviously interesting. Um, the I what I wish DeCaro would do, I believe he's the first author of that paper, is date known threads, like say you have 1,000-year-old fabric, blindly date it with
Yeah,
the X-ray scatter method.
yeah.
And if he could demonstrate reliability of the method and stuff, and validity, I think that'd be excellent. But I mean, that said, the methods make sense. And then there's like the mechanical stuff that, when I say mechanical, like they see basically the breaking point of
Yeah.
the linen threads that
Sure.
I think Fonte has done. That's
Mhm.
also interesting. Um, you know, but of course I don't like none of that to me. I'm not like the skeptics who jump on carbon dating like it's salvation. Like I see these things and I say, okay, that's interesting, and you just put it in the pile of pro versus cons for its authenticity. These guys, I have no reason to think any of these guys have anything other than, professional dispassionate investigation of the Shroud's authenticity. But I also do know that these are Shroud proponents. So um, I would say if I had to say for the scientific dating, there's
Mhm.
also like the vanillin degradation in the
Yeah.
linen fiber and stuff. If I
Yeah.
if I was gonna, place a bet just based on the evidence, I would put it with the proponents right now,
Yeah.
because there is no, and this is why I have to reiterate, like there is no medieval dating. There is no scientific medieval dating. The carbon dating is not, again, like that judge. I think we have to say, strike that from the record, disregard that. Um, to me, there is no medieval dating. Now, historically, I think skeptics actually have a much stronger case. You know, Descharny definitely shows up with that shroud in 1355. Anyway,
Yeah.
so 1389 or 1355. There's two dates in there. I forget which is which, but
1555. Yeah.
okay. And then you have the Arcus and is it Poitiers, Henry de Poitiers,
Yep.
these bishops
Darcy.
in Troyes that are complaining to the anti-pope Clement about the shroud being fake, and that they've caught the artist and stuff. So I think if skeptics just present that story, I think it's more compelling. Someone who's like seriously looking at this information. But we have to understand that these guys are not detached, unbiased people. I mean, Descharny built this cathedral in Lire, and now all of a sudden everyone is going there, and he's attracting significant pilgrimage and financial benefit. And just up the road to the northwest in Troyes, no one's going to the cathedral anymore, right? That This is how I envision it, and there's kind of evidence to support this idea.
Yep.
Um, and so these guys had every reason to want that shroud to go away, and so I'm not like super blown away. I mean, what we would have to believe is that Depoitier. Do you know how to pronounce his name? Henry Depoitier.
Not
Oh,
properly. Henry de
okay,
Portier is how I say it.
Depoitier. Okay, he supposedly got this artist in question, right? First of all, really, I mean, even back then, we would think that they would acknowledge the like the handiwork of this shroud,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And that maybe his name might be worth noting, you know, or like the method, or just something about this like amazing forged relic. Like if even just assuming it's a forgery, right, which was common back then,
Right. Right.
um, you would think that'd be worth noting. Also, de Poitiers is dead by this time that Diarchus writes this letter, and so uh, again, Diarchus, I don't know. Sorry, apologies.
Darcy is.
Darcius. This is why I write generally and
Yeah.
not speak.
Yeah.
So
So is
anyway,
right.
anyway, hey, you guys come into my field. We'll talk neuroscience. We'll see how you do with pronunciations. Anyway, so so uh, he has every reason to lie, and he has no one to verify the validity of his lie. And it might not even be a lie. It might be his genuine belief. Maybe he added in this witness idea, or maybe DRCs did have someone who he convinced to. I mean, we can't know. Again, none of that to me is like super compelling one way or the other. I, I think there is compelling stuff that we'll get to soon, but just to wrap up this historical thing. So, um, you know, as armchair historians, as I would say many people skeptical about this are. Now, obviously, there are professionals who feel this way too, but most of the people I encounter are sort of armchair historians, and they go, "Hey, the Shroud of Turin isn't mentioned before 1300, and it's the Shroud of Lyrae." But this, like, history isn't a Google search where you Google search the terms Shroud of Turin and Shroud of Lyrae and see how far back it goes. Whatever this thing is wouldn't have been called the Shroud of Turin before it was in Turin, right? It wouldn't have been called the Shroud of Lyrae before it was in Lyrae, France. And so, there are evidences of a similar relic
Yeah.
going back farther than this. Um, and so I think a pretty logical idea is that, and this is of course just speculation, but the pretty logical idea is that the Shroud worked its way through potentially King Abgar to Edessa, and it came to Constantinople in 944, something like that. And then in the Fourth Crusade, when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the Shroud of Constantinople disappears, and would have likely made its way to Greece. And that is where Descharnes is right before he brings the Shroud back to France. He's in Greece. And he's a famous knight. And so if anyone would have had the means or the reputation or whatever was required to secure that relic and bring it back to France, it makes sense that it would have been him. And the descriptions of the Shroud of Constantinople are pretty similar. I mean, they're pretty, they sound like the Shroud of Turin. Now, it does seem like it was probably normally viewed folded up. And that's why the icons we see of the Mandalion or whatever are just the head with the
Yeah.
sides of the linen. But it's not the stretch that skeptical people would make it out to be. I mean, all things considered, we have a really good historical record. Like, if this was the Shroud of Alexander the Great, and this is a common argument I'm sure everyone's heard, but we would have no problem. We'd say, oh yeah, this is absolutely the burial cloth of Alexander. The issue is, and this is, I think, the crux of the book, is like, for believers, we would like the Shroud to be real. If you're a skeptical person, if you're an atheist, you need it to be fake. Like, your entire worldview, it's actually it's the inverse of what usually gets presented, that
Yeah.
the believers are so biased. It's the perfect inverse of that. If you're an atheist, the Shroud cannot be real because it is direct physical evidence that your entire worldview is incorrect. And so you're going to argue much more religiously and potentially fraudulently, or, some gray area in between, that is fake. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. But anyway, so that's my take on the historical and scientific dating. I think it's actually the image itself that's the most compelling argument for its authenticity, though. But I'll
Okay.
pause there.
All right. Well, I do just have one last follow-up question on the history end before we transition to the science thing. Well, let me ask though, like, what sort of time frame are you limited on time at all, or like what
No,
sort of
I'm
time
I'm
frame?
I'm pretty flexible. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So, but just before I ask you that question, I do want to back you up because I think skeptics sort of betray their bias when they ask this chain of custody. They want establish every second of every year where was the shroud and prove it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they always kind of betray their own bias by saying like the 1350s is the first time the shroud shows up in
Right.
history. Well, that's begging the question. No, that's just the first time the shroud is mentioned that is universally agreed upon that it's
Yeah.
talking about shroud. But it's like saying, well, hey, Dale the Real Seeker came into existence on 2020 in 2020. Was I
Right.
born in 2020? No,
Right.
like I just didn't have that name or moniker or whatever, right? So yeah,
No, it's completely ridiculous. It's like the idea that this is why, and I don't put this in the book, is that the analogy isn't quite fleshed out yet, but it is something like I'm Googling and I'm in Wikipedia and I'm like first mention of Shroud of Turin, and it's like 1500s or whenever it comes to Turin.
yeah,
And therefore, the Shroud of Turin originated in the 1500s. Okay. Well, I guess maybe we can make the argument that it came from France. So Shroud of Lyre. Okay, see, 1350. But I mean, there is a Shroud of Constantinople. There is
yeah,
a Shroud of Edessa. Like
exactly. It's in the
we
records.
can't just choose to ignore. And so people talk about the coincidence between the dates. I think the coincidence goes the other way. I think they came up with the 1300s date and they go, where was the shroud in the 1300s? Boom, we have great evidence that it was here. Look, it's a coincidence. No, I don't think people really hammered that coincidence. I mean, I don't think that 1300 date was as like preached by the skeptical community until the carbon dating emerged. So I think the coincidence actually goes the other direction. I don't think the coincidence is as strong as skeptics like to say. But anyway, yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I
no, I
thank you for backing me up on that. It is the definition of cherry picking evidence that I don't tend to see this type of cherry picking in my scientific field, although I'm probably biased. There is some actually. There's some pretty big scandals in neuroscience research, but it's like so blatant with the shroud, and it makes me just keenly aware that this is not a scientific debate. This is a religious debate, and the strongest religious views are not on the people on the Christian side. It's on the skeptical side, in my opinion.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, I totally. That's my experience as well. So. All right. So let me ask you this final question then. So pretend you've managed to convince the skeptic and go, okay, fine. The shroud, we can date it back to the first century even. Now, let's say I agree with you as a skeptic. How the heck do you link it to Jesus though? Maybe this is the shroud of Jim Bob Jones or something down the street. Like, how,
Right.
how do you link it to Jesus?
I think this is actually surprisingly maybe the best skeptical argument because ultimately, as someone who believes in the shroud's authenticity, I mean, we're simply stunned by what appears to be an image that could not be created by man. And we go, well, do we have any evidence of a event, let's say in the first century, if we're confident in that date, that could have created an image like this? So there is kind of some logical leaps there. I'll be the first to admit that. But when you actually start to look at the image, it doesn't seem so fanciful to make that jump. I mean, everyone obviously has heard this, that it's photo negative, and etc. It is photo negative, and there are ways to create a negative image, I suppose. I mean, I need to figure out where I want to start this discussion. So let's just maybe start with like the least skeptical, and then become more skeptical. So when you look at the photo in negative, as Secondo Pia did in 1898, it's very photorealistic. And so anyone who's done photography knows that, the negative usually looks less like a person if you're taking a photo of a person. And then it's because the colors are inverted. The hair, if you have black hair, it's white and the skin is black. It just looks fun that, the teeth are black. It doesn't look photorealistic and negative, but the shroud does. And so when one interpretation of that I think is totally reasonable it would be that, okay, I'm not taking a photo of an object. I'm taking a photo of a photo negative. And so if you invert a photo negative, it's a photo positive. And so this is where this idea has come from, that the shroud is a photo negative. And and the intrigue sort of builds from here when you get to the 70s with the STRP team, and they're developing this device, which actually ended up not being very useful, I think, but to make sort of like a 3D rendering of an X-ray. And so I deal with medical imaging all the time. That's like my day job. And generally speaking, what you do is you're just assigning a color scale to some property of an image. And so like for MRI, which is what I work with, you might, you're looking at the spin decay of protons, and if it decays really fast, maybe you make that bright white, and if it decays really slow, you make it black. And so what you're left with is a grayscale image of the brain based on decay rate. And so you get this 3D image that contains information, and you use this color scale to do it. And so they were trying to do the same thing with X-ray, like how bright the bone is. I'll assign that a particular vertical relief value. And so something that's black, I'll position far from the viewer, flat to the paper. And something that's bright white, I'll position close to the viewer. And maybe I could sort of see this 3D image of this bone, of whatever you're trying to image with the X-ray. And for a lot of reasons, I don't think that it actually worked out super well, because X-ray is passing through the body and you get all these stacking effects, and it's kind of complicated. But actually it worked really well on the shroud. And the reason is because the shroud is sort of it's a monochromatic scale. And, there's arguments over all this stuff in the literature, but it does seem like the color intensity of every little pixel of the shroud, its color intensity is maybe based on how far away the fabric would have been from the object within the fabric. So, if we're going with the believer argument, how close it was to Jesus's body. And so when you look at this fabric under the VPA image analyzer, it looks like a 3D rendering of maybe Jesus, right? And now the question becomes, could a human do that? And this is where I think people like kind of tie themselves in logical knots, because it's like, yes, a human could do that. But a human that doesn't know what an image would look like in photo negative, because photography hasn't been invented, or doesn't really understand why 3D depth encoding would be important, like, would they undergo the effort to do that, to encode that richness of data in what is essentially a forged relic? And I think the answer is very clearly no. So it would have had to have been an accident inherent to the technique. And so the only technique I've seen that like even barely comes close to accomplishing this would be kind of this bas relief hypothesis, where if you make a statue of a man, but not a like maybe like just a statue of the front half, like if you were to take like a frontal or coronal section of the front half of a person and lay it flat on the ground, drape a linen over it. Although you got a problem there, because there's a front and a back image. So you would kind of need like two bas reliefs, the front and the back, positioned like this with the linen draped over it. And then if you took like not a pigment, but like an acid wash that sort of degraded the cellulose and the linen and sort of rubbed it over with a constant pressure, somehow. So it couldn't like really be with your hand. It would have to be, you need some technique for it to be in a constant pressure. Maybe you could encode some sort of like photonegativity and depth information. And there's a guy, Garla Shelley, who tries to do this. And it's sort of, the photo is sort of reminiscent of the shroud, granted, Now, of course, he's working off the shroud. So it's different than just creating something from scratch, obviously. But it still doesn't do it. I mean, you look at the photonegative image, you look at the 3D depth encoding, it's just not there. The detail is so low. And so this would really need to be like a institutional endeavor for like this would be like you would have to develop new technology to do something like this. And again, if you refuse to believe that the resurrection is possible, I think you could go there. I mean, I think it's reasonable. I'm not like critical of the skeptical people. If you like predetermine that the resurrection cannot be real, then yeah, maybe there was some sort of like government or Vatican led effort, not Vatican, but church led effort in the West, in France, to like recreate this relic in medieval times. Um,
One
it's a
thing.
stretch. It's a stretch, man.
Well, one thing you mentioned Garlashelli there, like even Garlashelli himself has admitted that he doesn't reproduce the Shroud's three-dimensionality
Yeah,
fully. Probably he gets some three-dimensionality, but it's not the true relief of a human form like we get in the Shroud. It's yeah.
yeah.
So even he admits.
It's just not it. At some point, as a skeptic, I think you got to just go, man, this is a stretch. Because this is someone who's working off the finished product and trying to recreate it. This is not someone who's sitting down and we say to him, hey, I want you to make a shroud that captures Jesus in it. Right? This is not how you would go about it. Right?
Yeah.
This is not you would press like a corpse into the cloth and you'd maybe like try to transfer bodily fluids or something. That's not what the shroud is. I mean, that's what people assumed it was for a long time, even believers. They thought it was like the perspiration or like some kind of divine quality of the plasma or the perspiration. That is not the case. I mean, there is bloodstains on it and there's evidences of wounds on it, but it is not that. It's monochromatic. And so you don't get these like monochromatic circumferential pigmentations of cellulose fibers from sweat transfer. Otherwise we'd see these millions of these things, every grave that had been robbed, which there was many, and people who were covered in linen, we have these imprints of people and we don't. So this is a major problem to suggest that some random relic forger in France who's not no evidence, he not a master by any means, right? Would have chosen this methodology. And so I think most skeptics now are coming around to this idea that, okay, it's got to be a light source or something. Like say, a scorch. They used to say a scorch, but it doesn't fluoresce to UV light. So it's not a burn. It's some kind of like, it's like an energy source messes with the chemical properties of the cellulose in a way that the closer the light source or energy source is to the fabric, the more intensely altered the fibers are. And so, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with this like camera obscura idea, right?
Yep. Nicholas Allen.
Yes, yes.
He's been making the round. I don't know if you've seen him. He's been doing a bunch of podcasts and stuff, giving his proto photo theory there. But yeah.
Oh yeah, it's hilarious. And I want to like reiterate to people like I was trying to write this book as someone who's like new to the Shroud debate, who can read and understand the papers. And so there's stuff obviously I don't know, and especially when it comes to like the more theological and historical things. But this camera obscura idea is absurd. you know, there's nothing about it that even rings true. The most important thing is it's a photograph. The Shroud, it's a traditional photograph, I should say. The Shroud is not a traditional photograph in that the man in the cloth is the light source. I mean, and that's where you get this 3D depth encoding. The camera obscura is a medieval photograph. And so the intensity of the image is based on the reflective properties of the object you're photographing. So the skin is going to be brighter than the dark hair, and it's when you see these camera obscuras, it's obvious that they're just they're poor photographs,
Yeah.
and that's not to mention all the practical limitations of having this huge quartz lens to take the photograph with, and the fact that the images fade so quickly, and that we didn't know silver, what is it, iodide, nitrate, whatever, could be
Yeah.
used as a photo. What is it?
Silver nitrate or
Silver
silver
nitrate.
sulfide as well.
Yeah, we didn't even know those were like photographic fixing agents at the time, or sorry, photoreactive at the time. This would have been done. So the whole thing, it's honestly, I know it's going to sound crazy to like a skeptical person, but it's more outrageous than resurrection at some point. I mean, it's close. Maybe as like as an atheist that you take umbrage with that statement, but it's just I think skeptics have to admit it's a stretch. And so like it's not just a little stretch; it is a big stretch.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't even, and this is very controversial, but I think it's compelling personally. It doesn't even get to like the most amazing aspects of the shroud. And one of those, which none of these really addresses, is the whole double superficiality aspect. Do you have thoughts on that before I get into it?
So yeah, I'm aware of it. Obviously, Giulio Fonte is the one. I'm a bit skeptical myself
Yeah,
of the claim. Like I wouldn't include it as what I call a minimal relevant feature.
right.
Yeah.
So what is the issue with that? Is it that you can no longer see the back of the shroud?
Well,
Or
yeah,
is it the imaging? Is it like the imaging methodology itself that I'm genuinely curious.
yeah, it's so basically some pro shroud scientists have said like that, so definitely it appears like there is an image of just the face on the back and stuff like that when you take off the backing cloth and stuff. But it could be that there's an issue with the lighting that's causing that. So some
Mm,
scientists are saying, look, we're not denying this feature is true. We just need more confirmation, like under controlled conditions before we will accept it. So that's Dr. John Jackson's opinion, for example. He's the leader of STEM.
I I agree with that. I it's if it's there, that's obviously interesting. It kind of makes you wonder. I just think the skeptical argument it gets more complicated if it's there. But I guess you don't really need the double superficiality. It's the superficiality
Yeah.
that is I think really difficult to explain through any means other than like some type of energy source. And I'm not saying energy like some kind of like woo woo new age person like energy. I'm saying, you know, whether it's UV light, some energy, you know, the scientific way we would describe energy, heat, I mean, whatever. It does seem like some type of energy transfer is required because of the way energy sources decay with distance. And so if it does seem like there is some sort of inverse relationship between the image source, the body, and the cloth. And I think this is like the final like problem for anyone trying to present a skeptical argument for how it was made. You need to invent some kind of like medieval magic, you know, whether it's the Knights Templar or like camera obscura technology or you have to entertain like semi miraculous explanations. And once you're entertaining semi miraculous explanations, it's like, okay, we're not really having a real argument anymore. Like you have a position and I have a position and we're just never going to be able to reach an understanding, you know? So
Yeah.
ultimately that's kind of my conclusion is that, and this is something Giulio Fonti said to me at one point, which I really liked. And I kind of like end the book with it. Like, I mean, realistically, there's more evidence for the shroud's authenticity that than we should suspect, like that we could expect. You know, like it's really, I mean, it might be fake. I'm not saying it's real. I tend to think it's real, but it could be fake. But still, we should not have such an artifact 2,000 years later that is so difficult to explain. Like, we're really asking for a lot to ask for more than this, you know, if it is real. And so, this is sort of how it seems like God works throughout the Bible is that you have every reason to believe that he's true, but some people still don't or can't. And this is obviously not a scientific argument. This is just kind of more of a philosophical idea. But it does seem like if it were any more compelling, we'd almost have no choice but to believe that it's real. And that's a line I just think we can't cross. I think that would be not in the nature of how God works in our lives to like prove to a scientist beyond any reasonable doubt that these events occurred, You know, this is sort of, there's has to be a little bit of faith involved to be confident that it's real. And this is obviously, this is not going to convince any skeptics. Um, but I think their view is also faith based. So I think it really, at some point, it is kind of like the evidence is as good as we could hope. You know, what do you think? Is it real or is it not? You know, is God real? Is God not real? Like, it's not, I don't think you're going to get ever, I don't think we will ever get to a definitive answer on this.
Interesting. That's similar to my friend Dr. Cheryl White. She was I just posted up an episode with her, and she has written a book, The Shroud in the Third Millennium, where she argues that exact sort of thing, that there will always be this gap in our knowledge kind of thing. The more we know, that gap remains kind of thing. And that's indicative for her that, yeah, God, something's going on here. God's involved kind of thing. And I also liked what you said about the skeptics too. Like if you're going to pretend that some medieval artist could possibly have created the shroud images, you have to incorporate all of these ad hoc assumptions and just so things that I like the quote from Barry, the late Barry Schwartz. I'm not sure if you met him or knew him,
No.
but yeah, he was a great guy. And he always says, look, if you tell me a medieval artist created the shroud images, then I believe in miracles kind of things.
Yeah, I love it. It's an impossible thing to not like. It's that is a natural conclusion to come to as an open and honest person. Like, huh? Like, so you're saying XYZ, and there's all the forensic evidence too, and the serum rings, and this and that, and it just it beggars belief. For this to just be some guy that was found in France who made just one of these amazing things that now, 700 years later, it's been scanned by every type of, fluorescence and, every type of scientific dating technique we have. And we still can't explain how it was made. I mean, I agree with his point. Like you're asking me to believe it's, I mean, I don't know. It's not necessarily a miracle, but we're getting there. Like we're approaching like a miraculous explanation. And so,
Yeah, I
it,
would love to. Are you familiar with Bob Rucker's work?
no,
He's a nuclear engineer. He's done a lot of work on the carbon-14 dating, like the
oh, nice.
statistical stuff, but also he's come up with an image forming hypothesis. So it's incredibly detailed. Since you're a scientist type yourself, and an expert as a neuroscientist, I think you would appreciate the level of rigor that he applies to his image forming theory. So yeah, just giving you a sort of a recommendation there that I
Can you share a little bit? I'm curious. So what is the source? What's the
yeah. So
is
he
it laser? Is it what is
No, so he's different. He's a radiation hypothesis, but he differs from Paulo de Lazaro. It's not ultraviolet. It's not
okay.
any electromagnetic radiation. It's charged particles from the body, specifically protons for the images, and then neutrons explains the carbon-14. But he's modified his theory where it's not like the protons create damage on the shroud. It creates sort of an electrostatic effect, and the
Mm.
fibers act like lightning rods, type thing, and that's what creates the images.
One of the reasons I like ideas like that is, and this is like an argument that Calvin made, is that you either have to believe the shroud is fake or that the disciple John is a liar, because
Yeah.
he walks into the tomb and he doesn't mention it. Now, I mean, I read all the different versions of that passage and I'm like, I don't come to the same conclusion as you. I mean, it sounds like the face cloth was neatly folded and that there's other pieces of linen. I mean, I don't know, whatever. I think that's maybe not the type of debate I should be having as a new Christian. Maybe I just don't understand it well enough, but I don't read anything like so damning in the gospel accounts that the shroud can't be real. But what I like about an idea like that is it's quite possible that the the fibers were changed in some way by whatever energies, protons, neutrons, whatever, such that the image was not like hyper visible originally. You know,
Right.
it could have aged differently over thousands of years to the point where it became more visible. And I think now maybe it's even fading a little bit. I think I've read at some point, but
Yeah.
um, to me, that makes a lot of sense. So that's very cool. I should say to people like, I'm, this is it for my Shroud career. I'm not looking to make like a Shroud research career out of this. My contribution to this, I feel like, was just more as a writer than a scientist, with the exception that I can, read and understand these papers. But um, so I just hope people who are like, I'd love to get this book in the hands of agnostic folk, and my last book, God's Eye View. I don't think if you're necessarily like a Shroud expert, you'll learn anything new in my book, other than maybe like logical ways of thinking about evidence. Um, but sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. But back to this idea, I love that idea, because if the image was not hyper visible in the beginning, it's very reasonable that it doesn't, because the skeptical critique is like, this image should have been featured center stage in the Gospels, which I don't necessarily know if I agree with, because everyone until 1898 thought it was like a fluid transfer. So I think it's reasonable that the disciples might have thought the same thing, that there's like some image from the fluid. But even better if the image really wasn't there at first. I think that's very compelling.
Yeah, I say same here. Arthur Lynn and Mark Antonacci goes for that, and that's what I always believed and stuff like that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. However, on the other side, just for fairness and for your interest, that Larry Stolley has done a lot of work on the biblical scholarship end, like trying to say that there are cryptic mentions of the shroud images in the Bible.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
he's written an entire book on that called Divine Hidden. Yeah, I forget what the name is off the top of my head, but Larry Stolley is his name. He's actually managed to convince me for one of them. I'm skeptical on most of them, but Galatians 3:1, I think there's a more probable than not case there that that might be talking about the shroud. So who
Oh,
knows?
that's
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you feel, but just taking the skeptical argument on for a second, do you read anything that you're like, "Oh, that's a direct refutation that the shroud exists in the gospel accounts?" I don't. I don't see anything. I mean, I get John mentions linen strips,
Mhm.
but he also says the other linens. I don't know. I just don't I don't read anything and I go, "Oh, yep, got me."
Yeah. No, there's
I,
nothing. And even I'll say the world's most knowledgeable shroud skeptic in the entire world, Hugh Ferry, was on my show admitting that there's nothing in the Bible that rules out the shroud as being the
yeah.
burial shroud of Christ. So even
Oh,
the
that's
knowledgeable
interesting. Yeah.
skeptics admit that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, yeah, I do appreciate like intellectual honesty on both sides. I think that's totally reasonable. Um and I kind of have a chapter in the book about like unlikely allies, It's so funny how quickly, listen, I think being skeptical is good. I see a real problem right now as a culture that we've just lost all faith in institutions,
Mm.
and it. I listen. I'm as happy to jump on like a weird theory as anybody, but just this like complete loss of credibility in all of our institutions. Like we just have no trust, and maybe that's good, but also there's problems with that. So when you get to a point like that, I think you become like open minded to anything. And I don't think that's good. I think skepticism is kind of like, in a certain amount, is a virtue. So I appreciate skepticism. I'm skeptical. Um, I kind of deploy skepticism in differing degrees depending on, whether I'm speculating or doing something serious in a paper, right?
Yeah.
But so I'm all for skepticism. What I do see increasingly though is like you have people that will believe everything, and then you have people who believe nothing, and they're just using increasingly like emotional, knee jerk, skeptical reactions to things. And I think both of those are problematic. I think we just got to like take the temperature down a little bit. The shroud is not like it's not like a salvation issue as far as I understand. I mean, it it's very interesting though. And I think I think if you're a skeptical person, if you can't admit like this is interesting, then you have some there's some deeper thing going on. You have some sort of like hurt, you know. Like I meet a lot of church hurt people now that I'm entering this like sort of science faith based conversations with people. There's a lot of like there's some it's there's like an emotional skepticism that I see in the
Yeah.
culture. And I do you see that?
I definitely do 100%. And, I experience it all the time. Like no, obviously I'm more sensitive on the pro Shroud side. So I get it from the skeptics, but
Yeah,
it's on both sides, obviously. But yeah, like I'll see this just emotional rejection of anything I say. There's this lack of critical thinking and
yeah,
trying to think of, okay, is the substantive point right or wrong? What are your reasons for and against it? Like, let's look at these things, point, counterpoint, stuff like that to get at the truth. So yeah, I'm a very I advocate for critical thinking. My whole thing, Real Seeker Ministries, I'm proud that my audience, it isn't all just pro Shroud guys. I've got Shroud skeptics who disagree with me, but even better, I've also got Shroud agnostics too, people who
yeah.
said they don't know and they listen to my show to try and get the truth because I give the best that both sides have to offer. And I trust my audience to be a real seeker and decide what they think is true
I
based on that.
I love that. That's fantastic. I'm like I might be a Shroud agnostic. I mean, I think in the book I definitely come off as like more pro Shroud, but at the end of the day, I mean, if next year, they did a real carbon dating, like which I would hate for them to destroy the Shroud this way, but take like, 100 different locations of carbon dating, thank goodness that will never happen, But but if there
They,
was some way to definitively say it's a 14th century artifact, I'd be like, huh, okay, I guess I'm not, guess I wasted some time writing that book, but like it wouldn't like change anything for me, like so I guess in that sense I am sort of a Shroud agnostic. It it's not it's the book is not like a work of science. It's a like am I crazy for thinking this could be real,
yeah,
and no, like if you're someone out there who's like it sure seems real or it sure seems crazy to think it's fake, like yeah, that is the rational way to look at this, I think. I think the skeptics like to just like use this like oh it's fake and you're an idiot for thinking it's real, like that's not serious, like that's childish, that's not a grown way of looking at this. So
yeah. That's so yeah, believe it or not, they've already got material removed that could be carbon 14 dated today. They don't even need to touch the shroud kind of thing. So like
oh, from where, from the original location or from?
it's yeah, I think there were certain fibers
Yeah,
removed.
I think I think that's the issue. Oh, fibers like lifted or something. Sorry to
The
interrupt you.
technology is such that yeah, we can actually date. We don't need to take like a big sample or cut it out anymore. They can date those fibers, from my understanding, anyways.
I let that sounds fantastic. Let's see. I mean, are you for that? I would be for
I'm for
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've even sent petitions to the Pope and tried to get him to
Oh my goodness.
agree to it, and yeah, just no response yet. I was hopeful with the new one that maybe something would happen, but who knows?
I wonder what the thought process there is. I mean, I guess I mean I think we have to acknowledge that no matter, if it comes out 14th century again, I think most people are still probably going to have more of like a conspiratorial mindset that like something's at play, right? Um, and that it really still is a first century artifacts and the burial cloth of Jesus. So I could see not wanting to go that route.
Well,
But
let
man,
me,
but
let
man,
me
if it comes back 2,000 years old, that's incredible. I mean,
yeah.
the rewards seem to outweigh the risks, in my opinion.
Okay, well, let me ask you this kind of thing. This is a unique idea, and I'll wrap up just not to waste all your time and stuff, but this is something that's a unique idea. So if it sounds stupid to you, you blame me kind of thing. But uh, um, so let's pretend that the shroud does come back 14th century. We carbon 14 dated or we X-ray dated or something. It's conclusive. The thing's 1355 kind of
Yeah.
thing. I would still believe that the shroud images are miraculous. It would just be a medieval miracle. And I argue God can do a miracle at any time in history. The scientific evidence which warrants our understanding of the images being miraculous, that's all the same, regardless of when it dates from.
Right.
I'm just curious about your thoughts. Is that, am I being conspiratorial or like what
I
do you
don't,
think? Am I
I
just
mean,
desperate?
I don't think it's a stupid idea. I think we as like people who are trying to present like the rational argument for its authenticity, we would have our hands full if we get a really serious 14th century carbon date. But listen, at the end of the day, either way, we are arguing that a miracle occurred. So it's not, yeah, I don't see anything too conspiratorial about that. I I think what happens if we got like a very like definite 14th century date, a miracle occurred. It's just a question of like how did we have technology to produce something like this in the 14th century? I still think the miracle explanation is on the table. I mean, I don't know. I think it's a more difficult argument to make, obviously, but at some point it's like this is always the case in like scientific discussion. Who has the burden of proof? You know, this artifact exists. You know, so is the burden of proof on you to prove that it was a miracle? I could see that argument, but also like I think the burden of proof is on scientists and historians and skeptics to explain how this thing was made. Because the explanations are not good. They're not compelling.
Yeah,
Um, the camera obscura is ridiculous, and I don't like to use like strong language like that, but I mean it's you know it's just not that's like the most far fetched explanation of any. The pressing on like a bas relief, I mean, maybe it's I don't know. I sure don't think so. Um, I would put that like one notch above camera obscura. Like we are the gap between the actual artifact and our explanation for how it was made is so big. It's insane. So yeah, if we were to get a 14th century date, I think we'd probably still have a similar argument. You're right.
fair enough. Fair enough. Interesting. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I think I've covered all my questions, but let me ask you as the guest, is there anything, any other topics or anything else in your book that I didn't ask you about or that you feel is important?
Um, I guess I'll just kind of reiterate why I wrote it. And I don't know. It sounds like you have a very educated audience. I don't know if this will resonate with them or not.
Mhm.
Um, for me, I just wanted to know, like, I read online that I'm an idiot because, we have the carbon dating, we have the historical coincidence, right? And it's like, but I don't feel like an idiot. I see problems in those arguments, and I see logical fallacies. I see straw man arguments. So I don't feel like an idiot. And then I go over to the pro shroud side, and it's like, it's absolutely real, and here's why, and here's this, and here's that. And I was like, some of those points maybe were made a little too strong. Like, as a person who's been endowed with a rational mind, like I just want to know if this thing is real. I want to know, and I don't think you can. That's my conclusion. I don't think we can know if it's real, but at least now I know like it very well could be. I don't. I no longer would like view a believer or a skeptic with derision. I think it's a really complicated argument. I think anyone who approaches a topic should do so with an open mind. Um, and if there's anybody in your life that you're trying, I think this book would not be for someone who's already like a shroud expert. This would be for if there's somebody in your life who's like, maybe, the fence sitters, as we call them, this might do it. Now, ultimately, I think it's real. And so I think there are some people who just will reject that conclusion no matter what. But you never know. I mean, I think we all come to belief through like circuitous and weird ways, and it's sort of additive. Something might have happened 5 years ago that got you kind of thinking, and then 5 years later you're exposed to something new, or I don't know. I just my life feels better now that I'm a believer. And so I would like to convince one person.
Yeah.
I have to undo all my atheist rants from my college days.
You have to
I have
make
to
up
make
for
some,
it.
I have to make
Redeem
some
yourself.
compelling yes, I have to make some compelling arguments. I have to, and I think the Shroud is one of those compelling arguments. I don't necessarily think it's the most compelling, um, but I
What?
think it's worthy of interest. Yeah.
I am kind of curious because you did allude to earlier, like that the shroud was not a reason you became a Christian. Like, if you don't mind sharing, like what were some of your reasons? Like, were you persuaded by Gary Habermas, like minimal facts type thing for resurrections, something else, or
Man, you saved the hardest question for the very end. Um, it was iterative, you know. I mean, it definitely started with the deconstruction of my first faith, which was scientism, right? And just seeing the the human nature, right, of the scientist in the lab, and just the it wasn't this like there wasn't this purity that like I had grown up to believe, that we're just all truth seekers endeavoring to test the hypotheses and disprove this and that. Now there is an ethic of that in some people. I tend to find it in the more religious scientists personally, but or at least open-minded scientists. You know, I don't know. And so that was like, I would say, step one, sort of like a deconstruction, and then just doing like a really deep dive into like, what do we actually know about the brain? What do we know about reality? And that was like a 1 year process that happened while I was writing my first book. And I'm like, oh, this world is so much stranger than we've been led to believe. And this isn't me saying this. I mean, this is Heisenberg, this is Planck, this is Bohr, this is Born, this is these guys were convinced that they were studying God's handiwork, right? Like the fathers of this atheist institution were all not all Christian, you know, there's a lot of Lutherans, you know, Heisenberg, Planck were both Lutheran, but you know, mostly deists. Like a lot of the Enlightenment scientists were deists, and Einstein was sort of like a odd pantheistic kind of guy. But none of these guys were like hyper rationalist atheists. And that's interesting, right? Like, how do we have this atheist institution founded by Christians and mystics and seekers, right? Um, and so I was like, okay, something's wrong here. And then when you actually look at like what we know about physics, what we know about neuroscience, it just seems absolutely ridiculous that like we are just matter in motion, you know, balls on sticks bound to other balls on sticks. You know, it's kind of like the freshman chemistry explanation of molecules and stuff. It's just completely ridiculous. So then now I'm like discombobulated, you know, like I'm like, oh my gosh, like, well, I got to really reconfigure my understanding of the world. What have we always thought, you know? And so then you start entertaining all these different philosophical and theological ideas, and you start noticing like, you know, the role of evil in the world is a big thing that I think brings a lot of people to faith. And that certainly was
yeah,
partly relevant for me. Just maybe this wasn't all of my own doing, you know, maybe God was at work, you know, in this kind of, I guess you'd call it a conversion. um but I don't know, like over the course of having kids was big, you know. I think having kids, okay, sorry, this is a long answer to your question. Is that okay? Can I
yeah,
keep
of
going?
course, of course.
Okay. So like a lot of my friends are atheists and agnostics. I think that just happens, you know, when you're in the sciences and stuff. And you once you kind of step out of that, and once you're just you believe in God, or even if you know you're a Christian, like you're all the way there, I guess. You start noticing things in them that you remember, you know, from your time as an atheist. And I'd see a lot of hurt. Like I see a lot of betrayal, loneliness, father issues is big. Like all the most famous atheists are you know, guys with father issues, you know.
Yeah.
That's a generalization, but And so I think there is this sort of hurt, um, and this like need to be in charge of your life and not wanting to abandon will and pride. And once you become a parent, you kind of realize like, oh, I get what it means to be a benevolent father. Like I get wanting them to have free will, also wanting to take care of them and spare them from harm, but also understanding that they need to get hurt in certain ways. And that was helpful too. I mean, there's listen, I still have doubts. There are still issues. I mean, random suffering is difficult for me to contend with. I have no problem. Evil makes perfect sense to me. Now, free will. God doesn't do evil. People do. Um, Evil's totally easy to understand. Even suffering kind of makes sense. Suffering has brought me closer to God. I've got issues I'm dealing with, but random like cataclysmic natural disasters and stuff, I still wrestle with that. But I mean, the point is, sorry, the point is, it was an iterative process. I see the problems with the atheist worldview. I see the benefits that believing has had in my life, and it just happened over time.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So yeah, obviously in terms of your book, I just want to share the screen to show it here. So hopefully that's are you seeing that?
Um, I'm not, but oh, there we go. Yep, there it is.
Yep.
Check it
So
out.
Shroud Pilled by Trevor Lohman, and it's coming out tomorrow. You can get it. So yeah, I'll probably have this show posted up at the latest tomorrow. So it'll, go ahead and go to Amazon and go ahead and get the book. There's tons of great information here about the Shroud of Turin. So
I'd
yeah,
love feedback. People can email me at shroudpilled@gmail.com. Good, bad. Again, like I said, I'm new to the Shroud, so if there's things I got wrong, I can always make a V2. So I'd love feedback. I'd love to know what people think.
absolutely. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and giving me a great interview and getting great your take on all these things about related to the shroud and stuff on the how do we respond to the shroud skeptics and their objections, which need to be dealt with. We can't just ignore them. And
All right.
do we have good reasons for believing in the shroud? And I think that you showed as a professional scientist here, there are great reasons to believe. So thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, I appreciate it. So yeah,
Thanks. Thanks for having me, Dale.
no problem. My pleasure. I'd love to have you come back sometime, but I'll perhaps on consciousness, because I can think of an atheist if you'd be up for like a discussion show. He's always going on about neuroscience and how all the neuroscientists say, no, there's no soul, there's no consciousness. So
Well, let me just end with this. That first of all, that statement is not true. It's just that that is sort of the consensus view of the field right now. So if you're going to study consciousness as a neuroscience, this kind of needs to be your conclusion. But yeah, sure, I'd love to. I will say on this particular issue, this is like a what who is it, Stuart Chase, or for some people no evidence is enough, and for others none is needed. This is one of those like irresistible force and movable objects discussions, consciousness and computation. But yeah, sure, I'd love to. Sounds fun.
awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that's it for now. Tune in tonight. I'm actually debating Daniel, the Quran only Muslim, on the topic of the atonement. Is blood necessary and essential for, atoning for sins? So that'll be around 7 o'clock tonight. But other than that, take care and God bless everybody.